Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Saturday. It's January 4th. Today is day 456 since the attacks by Hamas on the south of Israel on October 7th of 2023. January 4th, 2025, day 456. President Jimmy Carter's funeral procession and services began today in Plains, Georgia. Jimmy Carter was a steel-willed Southern governor who was elected president in 1976. He died in his home on December 29th. He was 100 years old, the oldest living U.S. president of all time. President Carter's time in office reshaped the Middle East and changed history when he signed or was present during the signing of the Camp David Accords, the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. It was signed on September 17th, 1978, following 12 days of secret negotiations at Camp David, the country retreat for the President of the United States in Maryland. The funeral services to honor Carter began today, January 4th, in his home state of Georgia. They'll conclude on January 9th with a state funeral here in Washington, D.C. at the Washington National Cathedral, where President Joe Biden will deliver the eulogy. Carter will lie in state at the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building for 3 days. I hope and pray, his example of peace, his book, Peace Not Apartheid, which caused so much angst, and many are saying was prophetic in so many ways. Many would say that Jimmy Carter had much more influence after his presidency than he did when he was in office. But when we think about his legacy of the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, peace seems so far away in the Middle East. Other news in the last 24 hours related to the Middle East. Congress will be having a vote on Tuesday on Capitol Hill. The U.S. Republicans are pushing forward a bill sanctioning or seeking to sanction the International Criminal Court, the ICC. GOP leaders at the U.S. House announced that the vote on a bill issuing sweeping sanctions for the ICC will be held on Tuesday. This signifies its prioritization. The vote will be held with just 1 hour of debate. No amendments will be allowed to be submitted. This also signifies, the desire for this bill to be pushed forward. This is in direct response to the ICC's arrest warrants put out for Gantz, Israel's former Secretary of Defense, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, stating their crimes because of the war on Gaza. There's also an arrest warrant out for the Hamas leader, Mohammed Diaf. Israel says that they killed him earlier in the war, but proof of death has not yet been verified. In Israel, Shin Bet has placed security around the home of Israel's chief rabbi, or one of the chief rabbis, reports that there are concrete terrorist threats against his life. The Shin Bet informed Rabbi David Yosef, he's the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. They informed him of these threats. They've placed security around his home. According to Israeli news sources, these terrorist groups have begun to threaten him directly as well. Protesters have also clashed with police after lighting a bonfire after the Israeli Defense Forces, after lighting a bonfire outside of the IDF headquarters, as they've been demonstrating for the release of hostages and demonstrating against the IDF. Because hostages have not yet been released, police have tried to extinguish the bonfire and have clashed with these protesters. Al Jazeera reported that some of the protesters were arrested as well. The clashes between the Israeli police and the protesters happened after a video was released by Hamas today. The video was of a hostage that's being held in captivity, Lily Elbag. She's 19 years old. She's from Yarhiv. She was one of the spotters who was kidnapped on October 7th from the Nahal Oz base. You'll recall that there were more than 50 women, several of whom were killed on October 7th. Others were taken hostage. That video was released today by Hamas. The family of hostage Liri Elbag approved for publication images of the video. They also called on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and world leaders to make decisions as if your own children were being held hostage. After the publication of the of the video of the hostages and missing family forum's headquarters released a statement calling on the public to join in demonstrations and protest vigils today on Saturday to demand the return of hostages. In Gaza, this was about 2 hours ago. It's now evening here in Washington, D.C. Al Jazeera reported that today at least 66 people were killed across the Strip since dawn on Saturday, January 4th, according to medical sources. At least 41 of them were killed in attacks in the northern part of the Strip. Several updates today come from either Al Jazeera or Haaretz, Israeli news sources or other sources from the Middle East. The last operational hospital in North Gaza has been shut down. The health ministry announced that the Indonesian hospital in Beit Lahia was completely shut down and is no longer able to treat patients. And the Israeli Defense Forces reported that there was a rocket launched from northern Gaza that landed near the Erez border crossing in South Israel after sirens were activated near a community located there in the Gaza envelope. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed in an interview with the New York Times that President Biden's visit to Israel days after the October 7th attacks was used as leverage to convince Israel to restart the flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza after the Hamas attack. You'll recall that immediately or shortly thereafter, Prime Minister Netanyahu said no food, water, gas, or electricity at all into the enclave until all of the hostages would be returned home. And the Palestinian Red Crescent reported that 9 security personnel who were overseeing humanitarian aid convoys in Gaza were killed in Israeli airstrikes, including 4 in the central Gaza town of Deir al-Balah. That was in the last 24 hours. Related to the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire agreement, of which there have been numerous violations, many would argue by both Israelis and by Hezbollah, the Hezbollah Secretary General Naim Qassem said in a speech that the organization will decide how and when to respond to Israel's violations of the ceasefire and that there's no timetable for a response. And the Washington Post wrote in response to Syria's leadership transitions that this could leave significant room for ISIS. They talked about how the shadow of ISIS could loom over Trump's presidency, how during President Trump's first term, he declared victory over the Islamic State. This was in December 2018. Trump had announced that the US-led coalition against the extremist Islamic group had completed the job of dislodging the terrorist faction from its major redoubts in Syria and earlier in Iraq. He said, "We've won against ISIS." This was a video at the time, adding that the US forces deployed in Syria were coming back now. Even during his first term, officials in his administration told their boss and reporters that ISIS's territorial losses did not mean that the group was extinguished and that an enduring mission was needed to keep militants in check. According to the Washington Post, more than 6 years later, now a detachment of U.S. troops still operates in Syria as a part of a continued mission and may remain as Trump starts his second term this month. So the conversation now is, since the Assad regime has been replaced in Syria, what's going to happen? There are concerns that the Turkish proxies in northeast Syria, that area that's held by the US-linked Kurdish groups, there's a ceasefire happening right now in northeast Syria. Many ISIS detainees are held in prisons in that area. Jake Sullivan told CNN this past week the single biggest concern he has is the resurgence of ISIS. In terms of his evaluation of Syria, he added that ISIS is doing everything it can to regrow its capabilities. Sullivan's imminent successor is Representative Michael Waltz from Florida, who's a mainstream Republican hawk. He hinted that Trump may not follow through on this longstanding vow to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. He says the president has been crystal clear on his mandate from voters to do everything he can to avoid being dragged into Middle East wars. But in Syria, he's clear-eyed about the threat of ISIS and that we have to keep a lid on it. The number of ISIS fighters in the field of Syria is estimated to currently be at less than 3,000. So the greatest vulnerability is in the maintenance of the ISIS prison camps in northeastern Syria, as I mentioned. Nearly 10,000 fighters and more than triple that number of relatives and children are kept in squalid detention centers, and the U.S. officials have warned that those are now breeding grounds for a new generation of radicalized militants. The camps are currently run by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a largely Kurdish faction, which is partnered with the U.S. to combat ISIS in those regions. That's called the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and we've talked about that group before. One of the spokesmen for the FDF, Farhad Shamsi, told the Washington Post that he hopes the Trump administration will preserve the U.S. footprint in Syria, which currently has about 2,000 U.S. soldiers in Syria. He is saying that he hopes that the U.S. will continue to remain. So that's where things stand in Syria. What do we have to look forward to in the weeks ahead? Biden's term is quickly coming to an end. There's conversation about the possibility of more weapons sales to Israel before Biden leaves office. We don't know what will happen exactly in his last days. But I thought I would close today with a prayer from one of our member communions, the Mennonite Central Committee, a prayer for Palestine and Israel. O God of life and love and peace, we witness the violence and injustice in your holy land, and our hearts break. Our hearts break for the people of Israel, for the victims of the violent attacks by Hamas, for those who live with fear and insecurity, for those who suffer from the intergenerational trauma of violence. Our hearts break for Palestinians, for the victims of the violent attacks by the Israeli military, for those being denied water, electricity, and medical care, for those who are refugees displaced from their homes. We especially pray that the weapons of war be laid down, that the walls of separation be dismantled, that all prisoners be released, that the demonizing of the other might cease, that political leaders would seek the good of all people in Palestine and Israel. O God, whose heart breaks for the world, may your justice dwell in the land, may your righteousness abide in fruitful fields. May the effects of righteousness be quietness and trust forever. May the effect of justice be peace. Enduring peace. May it be so in the name of Christ. Amen.